Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers Beyond on my Patreon tier. We're nearing the end of my critical thinking and logic course that I'm generously allowing out for free on my YouTube and giving as kind of a taste test for my Patreon Beyond tier, where I teach actual secular university philosophy courses and give you guys a kind of what you would have gotten for hundreds of dollars if you are paying to take an accredited course and that sort of thing. And Tyler Fowler asked me to start off with my critical thinking and logic course, and I've been very heartened to see that some of you have liked it. One of my Patreons, Brian with an I, said that he's really enjoying this course. That feels great. I love sharing knowledge, even secular knowledge, especially about something like logic, basic logic 101, because there's just so much, such a lack of logic and an understanding of how to use it in order to think critically about these important debates in religion and Christian versus atheist, or Catholic versus Orthodox, or Protestant versus Orthodox, etc., so on and so forth. Critical thinking truly is necessary. So yeah, we're coming to our final unit, the most important unit. Everything we've done so far has led up to this, and this is basically argument evaluation. How do we evaluate arguments? Great. So we know what arguments are, we know how to classify arguments, and we know how to take up a jumbled up mess that we hear out in the real world and reconstruct it into a proper argument in standard form and or using an argument diagram. But now that we have the arguments before us, how do we evaluate those arguments? And on that front, there are basically two goals for properly evaluating arguments. One is to determine what is reasonable to believe and or do, right? We want to believe as many true things as possible. And that will govern our actions, right? And if we believe as many true things as possible, then that will help us do the things that we want to do to achieve our goals and that sort of thing. But secondly, to determine what is unreasonable to believe, in other words, what we should disbelieve, right? We want to believe as little false things as possible, because having false beliefs is bad. So essentially, that's the goal of evaluating arguments. And there are 6 basic rules for evaluation of arguments. So the first one is, when you're evaluating an argument and you reconstruct it, we don't just criticize or reject wholesale an argument by merely denying the conclusion. My goodness, when I was on Skeptics and Seekers, fundy lay atheists like Darren Lute, this is all they do. They just mindlessly deny the conclusion, and they think they've made a substantive rebuttal by saying, well, I don't believe that, that's just your opinion, or something like foolish like that. They just merely deny the conclusion. That's irrational. That is illogical. That is not engaging in proper evaluation of someone's argument. No, you must, as the denier, you must give reasons why you deny the conclusion, and watch out for disconfirmation bias, undervaluing arguments, or an argument that somebody puts forward for their conclusion. In arguments, premises count as evidence, right? Premises are reasons and evidence to believe the conclusion. A lot of time, fundy lay atheists and skeptics who don't know about logic say premises or arguments aren't evidence. They absolutely are. And now that you've understand what premises are within an argument, you understand, of course, they represent evidential reasons for the rational person to believe. But in terms of the reasons, if you're going to deny the conclusion, well, you must provide reasons if you're going to be rational. You can't be the Darren Lute. You have to be more like a Christian, someone who actually thinks critically and provides reasons. But what kind of reasons am I talking about? Well, again, remember the elements of a proper deductively strong or an inductively strong argument, right? So you would either say, well, the argument is ill-formed. The logical inference from the premises to the conclusion is either invalid or non-cogent. You can also object to one or more of the premises and say that the one or more of those premises are unreasonable to believe. They're not true in some way. And or in the case of an inductive argument, remember you have that third way. You can say, well, based on the total evidence, this argument, the conclusion can be defeated. And remember, I have the argument can be defeated, but what I mean here is the conclusion can be defeated in the argument as being false based on outside evidence, not relevant to the premises. So those are the proper reasons that a skeptic of an argument needs to provide. They can't just mindlessly say, well, duh, I don't believe that, or that's just your opinion. That's stupid. That's not critical thinking. Now, sometimes our intuition does tell us that something is wrong with an argument or a conclusion, but we can't put our fingers on it, as to what's wrong with the argument. And is this good enough? Does that count as a reason? No. I will say that that's fine as a starting point, right? So some people with the modal ontological argument, for example, the best argument for the existence of God, I truly believe, even though the majority of people, even Christians, dismiss this argument, you are foolish. You are lacking discernment. You are not a critical thinker when you just dismiss this argument because we don't know what's wrong with it, but there's something wrong with it. That's not good enough. That kind of intuition or intuitional response may count as a good way to start saying, okay, maybe there's something wrong with this argument. Let me come up with a good reason and figure out what exactly is wrong with it. But you can't just appeal to your intuition that something's wrong, but you don't have a clue what it is as the ending point. No, you can't reject an argument, or more specifically, reject a conclusion based on intuition of this kind as an ending point. And unfortunately, a lot of atheists and skeptics online, they use that against things like the ontological argument. It seems wrong to me, so therefore I reject the conclusion. That's not rational. So that's our first rule. Don't merely reject an argument by simply denying its conclusion mindlessly. And what I mean by mindlessly is without a proper reason, as I've defined here. Secondly, here's another rule. Don't just accept an argument or specifically a conclusion because you already believe the conclusion is true. And remember, on the opposite end, we have to watch out for confirmation bias here. And look, just because you believe something, or let's say I even know a conclusion is true, I absolutely know Christianity's true. I don't have I shouldn't say absolutely, but I know on a balance of probabilities, Christianity is true. That doesn't mean that I have to accept every single argument for Christianity. There are bad or technically weak, right? Either deductively weak or inductively weak arguments out there. So even though I think the conclusion Christianity is true is true, a true proposition, that conclusion, I like that. If you give me an argument saying Christianity is true, God bless you, man. You are a genius. But the argument itself could be total rubbish. So for example, I could say, well, either the Christian God is true or the moon is made of green cheese. Well, the moon is not made of green cheese. Therefore, the God of Christianity must be true. That's a bad argument, right? It's a stupid argument. The premises are not reasonable. At least one of the premises, the first one, the disjunction, the either or, right, is not reasonable to believe. So there can be a weak argument for a conclusion that is true. So you don't just want to accept any conclusions just because you believe it or because you want it to be true. There's also a point that a bunch of bad arguments don't equal a good reason cumulatively to believe a conclusion that you think is true. So this is like stacking up a bunch of clouds. You're never going to be able, that never provides anything of substance to actually stand on in terms of your conclusion. You're going to, if you have 100 or 1,000 clouds, you're going to fall right through that stuff, right through that air, that gas kind of thing, whatever it is. Okay, rule number 3. make your criticisms of an argument specific. In other words, don't aim them at the conclusion. I'm hoping you're getting that. It's not about the conclusion, but it's either what you need to attack is either the inference or one or more of the premises. That's what counts as a good reason for attacking an argument. So you want to argue that one or more of the premises are unreasonable to believe, as I've said, and or that you have reason to disbelieve or to suspend judgment on their truth. Or alternatively, you want to argue that the logical inference, the move from the premises to the conclusion, is either invalid or non-cogent. That's what you need to provide as substantive criticisms of an argument. Number 4, make your criticisms of premises substantial. What the heck is a substantial criticism? Well, a substantial criticism basically provides reasons to think that the premise is not rationally justified or it's unreasonable to believe in one of two ways. Either you provide sufficient reason to think the premise is false, right? So this is where an atheist or a skeptic of an argument like Darren Lute would have a burden of proof. They would have to prove your premise is false. And if they have sufficient reason to do so, then yeah, that's a substantive criticism. Or another one, substantial reason, would be providing sufficient reason to suspend judgment on the truth or the falsity of the premise. So those are what substantial criticisms are. Okay. Now, what are some examples? So here are some examples of insubstantial criticisms, things that you get from the Darren Lutes of the world. So, you might get someone, well, maybe, or it's possible your premise is false, right? Sure, coulda, woulda, shoulda. A lot of things are possible, but that doesn't make them probable. And that's including your criticisms of an argument or the premise of an argument that I'm giving. It's just sheer speculation. Well, it's possible you're wrong. Yeah, but it's 99% proven that I'm correct. So who gives a dang if there's a 1% possibility that I'm wrong? That is a bad criticism of a premise. That is irrational. You should believe the premise. Or someone says, well, that premise hasn't been absolutely proven yet. 100% proven. That's kind of just the same thing, just in reverse, right? Well, you don't remember, we looked at the philosophical position of fallibilism in, I think, week 1 or week 2 of our lecture 1 or lecture 2 of this course, right? We don't need absolute proof in order to be warranted or justified in believing the truth of a premise or a conclusion. That's just foolish to require that standard of proof. And finally, here's the thing I was talking about with the Darren Lutes of the world. The employment of argument stoppers. Argument stoppers, they make me sick. And again, being in the religious field of debates, I would get this from unbelievers all the time. So here's Darren Lute. That's just your opinion. That's totally subjective. Who's to say whether that's true or not? Stuff like this. These are not substantive criticisms of a premise. This is just an attempt to mindlessly stop the argument and avoid it, basically, because you're scared that the person has good reasons for believing the conclusion and you've got nothing to come up with. So you just mindlessly go, that's just your opinion. Oh, man, I'm so relieved I don't have to deal with the argument. Well, that's not being a critical thinker. People who use these comebacks are, generally speaking, not taking the argument seriously on its own terms, and they can be simply dismissed as an irrational fool until they come up with a substantial criticism. And a good test for the substantiveness of a criticism is, again, to ask, how would a reasonable defender of this premise or this argument respond to this kind of criticism? And if they would just dismiss it as an argument stopper, 9 times out of 10, unfortunately, out in the real world, it is an argument stopper. Rule number 5, don't accept the conclusions of 2 competing or contradictory arguments. And this is, so seeing next slide. So this is from Dr. Klaas Cray. Thank you he saved me some time. I was getting a little bit lazy, so I just copied and pasted his slides. But he gives an example here. Suppose that an argument aims to support conclusion C, whatever that is, Christianity is true. But then you have a competing argument that supports the negation of that conclusion. It supports Christianity is not true. Well, Klass here says, well, you cannot at the same time think that both arguments are equally strong while being rational. Why on God's green earth would this be? Well, it's because this would clearly represent a logical contradiction. If you've got equal justification for believing Christianity is true and equal justification for believing that Christianity is not true, you can't believe both of those arguments' conclusions are true at the same time. That violates what we call the logical law of non-contradiction. And that's the reason why you can't believe both C and not C. That's irrational. I agree. Now, again, remember, sometimes we have competing arguments where they're not equally as strong as each other. So, one argument, the evidence for the premises or that sort of thing is stronger. The justification for the premises are stronger than another competing argument. And in that case, yes, you would believe the strongest argument in that case, whether that's in favor or against whatever the conclusion is, right? So that's, again, the principle of proportional belief that we looked at before, right? But if you do end up in this situation, sometimes in reality, we do end up with a situation where, especially because we're looking at a lesser standard, which is a little more subjective about justification, right? It's not about, a truth conducive epistemic criterion. It's more a subjective criterion. Well, do you have good reasons? And because of that, because we're looking at justification as the criterion, a justified true belief equals knowledge, in this course at least, you can get into these situations where, okay, well, yeah, I'm equally justified in believing both C and not C. Well, what are you supposed to do as a rational agent and a critical thinker? You suspend judgment. You say, I don't know which is true. I've got evidence on both sides and they are equally strong. Okay, rule number 6. Don't merely reject intermediate, or what we called before, sub-conclusions of a sub-argument, right? So it's the same rule above with conclusions in a main argument, but you don't want to reject sub-conclusions in an argument either without good reasons. You need to attack the premises of a sub-argument, and they need to be substantive criticisms, exactly like what we said before, attacking the premises and or the logical inferences themselves of a sub-argument. Now, there is one exception for inductive sub-arguments, because one can also rationally defeat the sub-conclusion. So when it comes to inductive arguments, there's an exception to rule number 6 here, because, well, actually, yeah, if you can defeat the sub-conclusion, or in the case of a main argument, the main conclusion, with outside evidence or outside evidence that's outside being relevant to the truth or falsity of your premises, well, then that does allow you to reject the conclusion, whether sub-conclusion or main conclusion, directly. So that is with the criterion of defeat for inductive arguments. You don't need to follow these rules. Now, when we're evaluating premises of an argument, what are some guidelines for us to understand whether they're true or false? So in the first place, you'll have premises that provide factual claims. They're factual premises. And for any premise, one must believe on the given total evidence in order for that one is reasonably proven to at a given time. So remember, our standard for knowledge, a justified true belief. I may be justified in believing in Santa Claus as a 5-year-old on the basis of my parents' testimony and the evidence that I have at that time. Whereas now as an adult, I'm not reasonably justified on the basis of the total evidence, including new evidence I'm now privy to, and that sort of thing. So you can be justified at one time versus another time. So Just remember that in terms of the truth of a premise. The second type of premise that you might get are things like generalizations. Well, when are those? How do you verify when a generalization is true? Or how do you falsify? Right? So there are different types. So all A's are B's. So that's a very high burden of proof, right? If you're going to verify that, well, you have to prove somehow that all A's are in fact B's. And that gets really hard, when like how do you all swans are white? Well, have you been everywhere where there are swans? Have you checked every single swan? How do you prove that? It's a very high burden of proof, and it's very easy to falsify. All you have to do is show that there's one A that's not a B, and there you go. The second generalization is for inductive arguments. Most A's are B's. This gives a medium burden of proof, right? You have to take a representative sample, or perhaps you count the majority of A's as being B's. And to falsify, again, it's kind of balanced. You have to show that a representative sample representing most A's are not B's in order to falsify it. So it's kind of an equal burden of proof on that front. Now, what about some A's are B's? Now, we have to understand something in philosophy or in logic. When we say the word some A's are B's, that has a specific meaning. Some in logic means at least one. So as long as there's one, you're kind of saying here, some means at least one A or more A's are B's, right? So it's a very easy burden of proof. If you prove that even one swan, A is a B, or one swan is white, then that proves the claim that some A's are B's. That's what some means. Just be understanding that that's some terminology that in logic, the word some doesn't mean, oh, well, you need at least 3 or 7 or whatever. No, if you have one or more, at least one or more, that would be proving the truth of some A's or B's. On the contrast side, to falsify, you have a high burden because you have to show that there's not even one or more A's that are B's. And it's kind of the same here with saying no A's are B's. Okay, well, that's a very high burden on the verification standpoint. You have to, again, somehow find a way to show that prove a universal negation. Now, contrary, some atheists and skeptics are quite stupid. They'll say something dumb like, well, you can never prove a universal negative. That is by far the dumbest, most foolish thing I've ever heard. It's just logically dumb and not true. We can prove universal negatives all the time. It's a high burden of proof, but it's easy, right? So, for example, Darren Lute thinks he can prove that no God exists because if you define God as a spiritual being, he thinks he can prove a logical and or factual contradiction between a spiritual God existing in this thing is just logically contradictory according to him, and it's factually contradictory. Well, if that's true, yeah, you can prove that no A's, at least in this physical universe, are B's, and or no A's where the laws of logic apply, they can't be B's. There are no gods that are spiritual. Now, Darren Lute's argument, of course, is quite foolish and wrong and false, and there's no evidence to back that up at all. It's just speculation on his part. He's just asserting what he wants to be true. But that's beside the point. The point that I'm saying here is that it is possible, even though it's a high burden, to prove a universal negative. And we do that all the time, right? We know there are no flying spaghetti monsters orbiting the Earth. And it's very easy to show, right? It's easy to falsify because, again, if you can just show one or more A's are B's, then that falsifies these claims. So that's kind of the table for going over premises offering generalizations. Okay, now with compound statements, once again, remember we went over the truth values established earlier in lecture number 4 for conjunctions, conditionals, disjunctions, and again, here is that slide. I'm not going to repeat myself for those. But I do want to say something about conditional statements in particular. So remember, as we learned before, a conditional statement right here on the bottom, if John had cake, then Jill had pie. Conditional statements are false only if the antecedent is true. If it's true that John had cake, but the consequent is false. It's false that Jill had pie. If that is the case, then the conditional statement itself, if John had cake, then Jill had pie, is false as a whole. So that's what we learned last time. But now I want to kind of explain, well, why is that the case? Why is that? Why is a conditional false if the antecedent is true, but the consequent is false? And this is where we need to start to learn about necessary and sufficient condition. Recall that conditional statements are compound statements of the variety if P, then Q, right? If that no good, nasty heretic David Russell throws that water balloon at me, then I'll be wet. P, or in this case, Davy Russell pitching his water balloons at me, is the antecedent. My being wet is the consequent. Okay? So if the antecedent is true, then what this conditional statement is saying is that the consequent is guaranteed to be true as well. And again, if it's ever the case that in reality an antecedent is true, David Russell throws a water balloon at me, but I'm not wet, well, then that disproves the conditional statement itself. And the reason for this is because conditional statements involve both necessary and sufficient conditions. Okay, so in this case, the consequent, my being wet, provides a necessary but yet insufficient condition for the antecedent to be true. So my being wet is necessary, according to the conditional statement as a whole, for David Russell to have thrown a water balloon at me, for it to be true that he threw that at me, that antecedent statement. Okay, so the consequent is necessary for the antecedent to be true. On the other end, the antecedent, David Russell's throwing that water balloon, is not necessary, but it's a sufficient condition for the consequent to be true. David Russell's throwing a water balloon is sufficient for it to be true that I'm wet. It guarantees the truth of that conclusion. If Trudeau is the prime minister, then he's a politician. So here's class's example. So in this case, the antecedent, if Trudeau is the prime minister, that's sufficient to say, well, therefore Trudeau is a politician. The consequent is true that Trudeau's a politician. But the truth of the consequent, Trudeau's being a politician, well, that's necessary for being a prime minister, because a prime minister is a politician. But it's not sufficient for being the prime minister, because no, I could be a politician and be the mayor. I could be the premier of Ontario. I could be the governor of California, that fruitcake, Gavin Newsom. Oh my gosh, or my gosh, the new VP. I could be the vice president of the United States or something like that. So being a politician is necessary to be a prime minister, but it's insufficient. It's not sufficient for entailing that. Whereas the reverse, being a prime minister, is sufficient to prove that Trudeau is a politician. But it's not necessary because, again, I could be the president of the United States, and that's sufficient to prove I'm a politician too. Through contraposition, it's the same thing, right? If you say, if not Q, then not P. That's saying the same thing. Not Q, right, is sufficient to entail not P. Not P is necessary for it to be true that not Q, right? So here's, again, the same example. If Trudeau is not a politician, then he is not the prime minister. And that's the valid argument pattern called contraposition. So class gives some more examples, again, of this necessary and sufficient conditions, which explains why a conditional statement is true only if is only falsified when the antecedent is true, but the consequent is false. And here's an example that I like, right? So Necessary conditions, think about it this way. Oxygen is necessary for fire. So if oxygen is present, if fire is present, then you know oxygen is also present, because oxygen is necessary for fire. You can't have fire if there's no oxygen. Fire is sufficient to entail the truth of oxygen, right? If you have fire, that automatically entails you do have oxygen. But if you know that you have oxygen, that alone is insufficient to say that fire exists, right? Oxygen's all around me right now. There's no fire. So clearly you need oxygen as one of the necessary ingredients or one of the necessary conditions, but it alone is insufficient, right? So with the necessary conditions, you've got to ask this test. Could you have the consequent without the antecedent? Sorry, I said that wrong. Could you have the consequent antecedent without the consequent? If the answer is yes, then the conditional is false. If the answer is no, then you have a necessary condition. Here's another example, right? So let me look at noodle soup, right? If you make chicken noodle soup, then you must have noodles, right? So if you have chicken noodle soup, one of the necessary ingredients is having noodles. Having noodles is necessary in order to have chicken noodle soup. You can't have the former without the latter. But having chicken noodle soup is sufficient to entail that it's true, you have noodles. So what we would say is that the truth of the antecedent suffices for the consequent to be true in this case. So I hope that these examples make sense. So that's what I wanted to know about conditionals. And before I move on, to see this, how might this work in a real live argument? Well, I employed the use of conditional statements and necessary and sufficient conditions to assess the claim of the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, the false claim, biblically false claim of baptismal regeneration. So let's take a look at the Roman Catholic arguing for baptismal regeneration there.
Now, the Catechism of the Catholic Church gives us a description of the necessity of baptism for salvation. So the key point is paragraph 1257. So the 1250s is where the Catechism talks about baptism and its relation to salvation. So here it says the following. The Lord himself affirms that baptism is necessary for salvation. He also commands his disciples to proclaim the gospel to all nations and to baptize them. We just saw that in the passage earlier. Baptism is necessary for salvation for those to whom the gospel has been proclaimed and who have had the possibility of asking for this sacrament. The Church does not know of any means other than baptism that assures entry into eternal beatitude. This is why she takes care not to neglect the mission she has received from the Lord to see that all who can be baptized are reborn of water and the Spirit.
So interesting. Listen to what he's baptism by water baptism is necessary for what? For salvation. So this is a conditional claim that the Catholic Church is making, as do the Eastern Orthodox and everyone who goes for the biblically false doctrine of baptismal regeneration. They say water baptism is a necessary condition for salvation, or what they really mean is regeneration, or what Protestants call justification. Great. So we can make a conditional statement out of this, right? Baptism is necessary. So the necessary condition is the consequent, right? So, okay. And what's the antecedent? Well, in this case, it's salvation or regeneration or justification. So we can make that as a conditional. One of the conditionals here of the Roman Catholics is if one is saved or justified or regenerated, then they've been water baptized. That's the first conditional that the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox have said here. We've got this conditional statement, and that can be analyzed. But let's continue on with Lewis for a few more minutes, and then I want to show something else.
To the next slide. There are some further descriptions of the effects of baptism in paragraphs 1279 to 1280. This is the summary statement on baptism. It says that baptism, first, it grants forgiveness of original sin and all personal sins. This only applies to sins committed before baptism, by the way. Those after baptism, you need the sacrament of reconciliation for that. It makes one born again as an adoptive son of God the Father. There's that born again language once again.
Okay, so what's interesting here, the effects of baptism. This implies a cause and effect relationship. In other words, sufficiency, right? So what he's saying here is water baptism suffices or is sufficient to bring about the consequent, the effect. What are the consequent? The effects that he's forgiveness of original sin. That's regeneration. That's justification, or what he's calling salvation. So water baptism is sufficient to bring about the consequent effects, namely salvation, justification, or the forgiveness of original sin and all personal sins. And it regenerates one. It makes one born again. So the Catholics here have two conditional claims. Very interesting. And so on the one hand, they claim that, well, if you're justified, if you're regenerate or saved, then that suffices to show that you're water baptized. Okay? There's a second conditional claim of baptismal regenerates, like Orthodox and Catholics here, where they say that if you're water baptized, then you're regenerate, then you're saved. So it's almost a biconditional claim here, right? It works both ways, and that sort of thing. But just to keep it simple, let's treat them as two separate conditionals, and that's where I went in the debate with Lewis. I'll just show that in my debate here around the 42-minute mark. I said that water baptism is neither necessary, and I proved this with actual biblical examples in Acts. It's neither necessary for salvation, and salvation itself is insufficient to entail the truth of water baptism through actual examples in the book of Acts. So that was my argument in my debate with Lewis, starting here around the 42-minute mark for point number 5. All right, so getting back to the lecture here, now let's look at definitions of words. If we're going to evaluate arguments, the definitions of words play key roles, right? In order to understand, we have to understand that there are at least two broad types of definition. So there is the reportative or descriptive definitions. So when you look in the dictionary, the Webster's Dictionary or Merriam-Webster, whatever it is, the online dictionary or whatever, these are providing us with descriptive or reportive definitions, how the words are used in pop culture or generally, and that's in the English language or whatever. It's just reporting or describing. The word gay means you're happy in the year 1960. Well, now the dictionary defines it. Well, now it means you're a homosexual, right? So the dictionary are just describing. They're not providing us with a normative definition, the way that the word ought to be defined. And that's entirely different. Sometimes arguments will hinge on whether you're giving a descriptive or normative definition. So think of debates in the word, life, a human life. What does it mean? The definition of a human being. What's the normative definition of a human being versus the descriptive definition, right? Are you a human being upon conception? Or are you a human being, just a clump of cells for the first few months? So therefore you can slaughter your baby like a savage, godless, immoral thug kind of thing, if you believe in abortions and that sort of thing, right? Well, it all hinges on, what's the proper normative definition of a human life as to whether you can slaughter that baby or recognize it is a real human life upon conception, and how dare you take that life? How immoral, how disgusting, how revolting. Or debates about marriage, gay marriage versus real marriage, right? Marriage is between a man and a woman. Well, that's based on the biblical definition of marriage. But is the biblical definition of marriage the normative one? Is that what marriage ought to be defined as? Or as the homosexuals and transgenders and LGBTQ nutballs like to say, is marriage? No, we can just redefine marriage anytime we want. And the normative definition is just, well, it's an agreement between two consenting adults and the state, or a contractual agreement recognized by the state between two consenting adults. Is that the normative definition of marriage? Hint, no, it's not. The Bible, God, defines marriage. But the point is, there are going to be arguments on that. And depending on if we're making an argument using specific words like marriage or human life, you can see how it's, understanding, are we giving a descriptive or a normative definition here, will be important. And sloppiness about definitions can lead to bad arguments, misunderstandings, and confusions. And as we'll learn about in our final class, it can often lead to certain logical fallacies, such as the fallacy of equivocation, which we'll learn more about, and that sort of thing. But it can lead to ambiguities or vagueness and stuff like that, right? So when it comes to definitions, another way to categorize them is, do we have definitions that are too narrow or too broad? So for example, if a definition is too narrow, it will exclude things that it shouldn't. So Class gives his example here. So being enrolled at university, a student is someone enrolled at a university. Well, that's too narrow because it excludes high school students, kindergarten students, students at colleges, students at an apprenticeship program or something like that. So in this case, the definition of student is too narrow if you're defining it as only someone enrolled at a university. Being enrolled at a university is not a necessary condition for being a student, but it is sufficient for it. That's same with the other example you gave about Jason Trudeau. Him being the prime minister is sufficient, but not necessary for being a politician, because you could be the vice president or the president and still be a politician, or the mayor of Toronto. On the other hand, a definition is too broad if it includes things that it should not. So let's say a computer is an electronic device with a screen. Well, that's great, but the definition would also include TVs. Those are electronic devices with screens, but TVs are not computers. So in that case, it's broad because it includes things that it should not. Now here's something to understand is that, but what's important here is that there are times when a definition can be both too broad and too narrow. So let's look at the first example from class here. A dog is a four-legged mammal with a heart. Well, it's too narrow, right? It excludes things that it should not. So for example, there are dogs that have been in car accidents, and there are three-legged dogs, right? Or two-legged dogs. If you watch Bondi Vet, you'll see these. So therefore, it's too narrow. It excludes three-legged and two-legged dogs. On the other hand, it's also too broad because it's including things that it shouldn't. Elephants are four-legged mammals with a heart. Cats are four-legged mammals with a heart. So in this case, this definition of a dog as a four-legged mammal with a heart is both too broad and too narrow. Okay, so that's it in terms of this lecture. Next time, we will finish off the course with the final lecture, lecture number 9, on evaluating arguments in Unit 4, looking at the logical fallacies, something that Tyler has been looking forward to. Although he's been reading all these books, I think he's far beyond this course. This is, again, a first-year university course, but we will look at, about 17 or so logical fallacies, some of the ones that are most common in logical arguments. That said, before we move on, I gave you guys homework in our last lecture on argument reconstruction, and I gave you 3 examples. So I'm just going to quickly go over the first one and then show you guys the answer for the third one just to save time. But okay, so the first one, here's an amalgamated steps for our argument reconstruction. Mark all the premise and conclusion indicator words and ignore or eliminate non-argumentative or irrelevant material. Number all the statements separately in the argument. Remember, conjunctions are separate assertions or separate statements. Identify the main conclusion of the argument, step 3. Step 4, identify any explicit and or implicit premises that directly support the main conclusion, and keep an eye out for those argument patterns, cogent and deductively valid argument patterns. Step 5, decide whether these are dependent or independent premises, and if needed, draw a diagram of the main argument's conclusions and premises. Step 6, determine whether there are any sub-arguments, and repeat steps 3 through 5 for them. Finally, step 7, put the argument into standard form and or complete the full argument diagram for the argument. So let's do that with the first one. So step 1, mark all the premise and conclusion indicator words. Well, Mayor Leclerc must be corrupt because is a premise indicator word. His behavior suggests that he's either corrupt or incompetent. So this is given as a reason for the main conclusion or some conclusion. He's not incompetent, though, because another premise indicator word. He seems to be very good at getting self-serving bylaws passed by City Council. Step 2, number all the statements separately in the argument. And remember, conjunctions are separate statements, disjunctions are not. So I misstated that in the last episode. So, okay, statement 1, Mayor Leclerc must be corrupt. Okay, that's the statement. Statement 2, because his behavior suggests that he's either corrupt or incompetent. Statement 3, he's not incompetent, though, because. Statement 4, he seems to be very good at getting self-serving bylaws passed by City Council. So there are 4 separate statements in this argument. The second sentence is a disjunctive statement and counts, therefore, only as one statement, not 2. So I misstated that again. The third sentence has 2 separate points within it and needs to be separated into 2 separate statements. So the indicator word because signals that he's not incompetent, and so it's a conjunction, and he seems to be very good at getting those self-serving bylaws published. So 4 statements. Step 3, identify the main conclusion. What is the main thing this guy is trying to get you to believe as a rational agent? Well, I believe it's statement 1, that Mayor Leclerc must be corrupt. That's what he wants you to believe. And so we can actually rewrite that going in according to the rules of standard form and kind of bring statement 1 to the end and put therefore Mayor Leclerc must be corrupt, because that's our main conclusion. Step 4, identify any explicit and or implicit premises that directly support the main conclusion. Well, I've highlighted these in red. Statement 2 is a reason, right? Because his behavior suggests that he's either corrupt. So that's speaking to the main conclusion of him being corrupt. So we know he's either corrupt or he's incompetent. Statement 3 is he's not incompetent. So it looks like these 2 statements speak directly to the truth of the main conclusion. What about statement 4? Well, because he seems to be very good. Well, this is a reason. It's a premise. It's got a premise indicator because, right? It's got that premise indicator word. But what is it proving? It's not proving that he's corrupt. It's proving he's not incompetent. It seems to be counting in favor of statement 3. So this is not a part of the main argument. So I've highlighted in red what the 2 premises are. Now, are these dependent or independent premises? Well, look at this. Because his behavior suggests that he's either corrupt or incompetent. So either Mayor Leclerc is corrupt or he's incompetent. That's a disjunction. We learned about the valid deductive argument pattern, the disjunctive syllogism. Are the 2 premises speaking to the main conclusion fitting that pattern? You betcha. So it looks like it's saying he's either corrupt or he's incompetent. The next premise statement 3, he's not incompetent. So therefore, he must be corrupt. Well, this is a disjunctive syllogism or an argument by elimination. And therefore, these 2 premises are dependent on each other in order to establish the truth of the conclusion. Now, if we were to draw the main argument, here's what it would look like. 2 and 3, and they have the line underneath proving that they're dependent. And from that, we can infer the logical arrows represent inferences. The circle, the conclusion, statement 1, therefore Mayor Leclerc is corrupt. Fascinating. Is there any sub-arguments here? You betcha. Because remember, we saw that. What about statement 4? What do we do with this? What role is that saying? Well, it's a reason. It's got a premise indicator word because he seems to be good. It seems to be supporting good at getting bad bylaws passed by city council. So, okay. So that proves he's not incompetent. So statement 4 is a reason for believing that statement 3 is true. That looks like a sub-argument where statement 3 is the sub-conclusion in the argument. But beyond that, is that good enough? Is that a strong argument? Well, no, it's a very weak argument. So given the principle of charity, we also have to ask, well, is there an implicit premise that's missing and not explicitly stated? And I suggest statement 5, and highlighted in purple. If someone is very good at passing self-serving bylaws, then that person is not incompetent. And I think given the principle of charity, this does seem to reflect whoever is giving this argument, their intentions. This is the premise they intended to have said, or something along these lines. And this allows for a valid argument through modus ponens as a sub-argument, right? If someone is very good at passing self-serving bylaws, then that person is not incompetent. Well, Mayor Leclerc is very good at getting self-serving bylaws passed by city council. Therefore, he is not incompetent. It all fits. Now, if we were to put this argument into finalized standard form, we can do it this way. So you have to renumber it in order, right? So Mayor Leclerc is very good at getting self-serving bylaws passed as the first statement in order. Number 2, if someone is very good at passing self-serving bylaws, then that person is not incompetent. And in brackets, we write implicit premise because this was not explicitly stated by the arguer. But in order to create a deductively valid argument pattern, we've implied that the author wanted to say this. Therefore, and so you'll see here, I've messed up. So this should say, because this is a sub-conclusion, this should also say, therefore, right? Because this is a deductive argument, it's not inductive. And you conclude statement 3, therefore Mayor Leclerc's behavior suggests he is either corrupt or incompetent. Okay, what have I? Okay. So sorry. So technically speaking, so 1 and 2, the sub-conclusion is statement 4. Okay, why I did it. Okay, so therefore, he's not incompetent via modus ponens, or affirming the antecedent, right? The premise 1 is affirming the fact that he's good at self-serving bylaws. Therefore, we know the consequent is true. That's sufficient to say that, well, therefore he's not incompetent. And from that, we get premise 4, therefore he's not incompetent. And I've got the justification in brackets here from premise 1 and 2 via modus ponens. Now, why did I put premise 3, which is a premise in the main argument? It's not a part of the sub-argument. Now, remember our rule with standard form. The reason I did it this way is to prove it doesn't matter what order the premises are in, so long as they are above the conclusion which they support. So in this case, I've kind of done it in a mismatched manner. But both of the premises 1 and 2 of the sub-argument are above the sub-conclusion that they support. So therefore, it's fine. And this is a premise in the main argument, is above the main conclusion. So therefore, that's fine, that Mayor Leclerc is corrupt. So how would we draw the diagram? Well, here it is. You've got 1 and 2, an implicit premise supporting statement 4 that Mayor Leclerc is corrupt. Mayor Leclerc being corrupt, and the disjunctive premise 3 that he's either corrupt or incompetent. Since we know he's not incompetent, these work together to prove Mayor Leclerc is corrupt, our main conclusion in premise 5. All right, cool. So that's it for argument 1. Now I'm going to skip number 2 and go on to argument number 3. This is the most complicated one. So if you remember, this was the one that says either lefty committed the crime or righty did. If righty committed the crime, then he left fingerprints everywhere. But since righty was wearing gloves, he didn't leave fingerprints everywhere, which means that we can be sure that he didn't do it. And so, of course, lefty did it. Now, if lefty did it, then most detectives were wrong about him. Sherlock is a detective, so there is a pretty good chance that Sherlock was wrong about lefty. Now, just notice we have a couple of conclusion indicator words here, right? So is a conclusion indicator word. Just wanted you to notice that right off front. We have a disjunction here. We have a conditional statement, so it looks like there are some argument patterns. But let's just take a quick look at the answer. Just to save time, I won't go over it. So here's the answer to this argument in standard form. The main conclusion they want to prove is that Sherlock was wrong about lefty. That's the main thing. And it's an inductive argument, probably. How do we know that? Well, it comes from premises 9 to 10. Sherlock is a detective, and we know that most detectives were wrong about lefty. These directly support the main conclusion here. How do we conclude that most detectives were wrong about lefty? Well, that's a sub-conclusion of another argument involving premises 7 and 8. If lefty committed the crime, then most detectives were wrong about lefty. Yep, that speaks towards this sub-conclusion. And lefty did commit the crime. Great. So that's the sub-argument there. 7, 8, and 9 is the sub-conclusion. Okay, but lefty committed the crime. How do we know that he committed the crime? Well, because we know that either righty or lefty committed the crime, and we know that righty did not commit the crime. So these, again, speak to this sub-argument with premises 5 and 6 and sub-conclusion statement number 7. Okay, but that depends on how do we know that righty did not commit the crime? Another sub-argument. Well, if righty committed the crime, then he left fingerprints everywhere, and righty didn't leave fingerprints everywhere. So that's how we rule out righty. Another sub-argument involving statements 3 through 5, right? With 5 being the sub-conclusion, and that's through modus tollens. I should also be noting the argument patterns here, right? Argument by elimination, otherwise known as a disjunctive syllogism. Okay, well, how do we know that righty didn't leave fingerprints everywhere? Well, once again, we have our last sub-argument going in reverse order, which is through modus ponens. Well, if righty was wearing gloves, he didn't leave fingerprints everywhere. Sorry, righty was wearing gloves. That's what we have explicitly. Now, that means there's an implicit premise, right? So if righty was wearing gloves, he didn't leave fingerprints everywhere. And that's how we can conclude sub-conclusion 3, that righty didn't leave fingerprints everywhere through modus ponens. And that's an implicit premise. As is statement 9, this is also an implicit premise because, again, Sherlock was wrong about lefty, and we have Sherlock as a detective mentioned explicitly in the text here. But notice too, with the conclusion, so there's a pretty good chance. That's what indicates the final conclusion is inductive, right? That's how we know, therefore probably Sherlock was wrong about lefty. And that's why we use the generalization of most, the quantifier most detectives, instead of all detectives. And we don't make this a deductive argument. So that's what the argument looks like in standard form. Here's what it looks like as an argument diagram. You can see premise 1 and 2 supports the sub-conclusion 3. 3 and 4 together support the sub-conclusion 5. 5 and 6, so on and so forth. It's the same process all the way down to statement 11. So this is what the argument diagram looks like. If you want to get a good little glimpse of the structure in visual terms. So there's your answer for these two arguments, and I hope that was helpful. I'm sorry I didn't have time to go over the other one. What is going on? Why is this going up? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So that's it for today. Next time we will finish this course with the final lesson in logic, looking at logical fallacies. So look out for that next time, especially you there, Tyler. I know you'll love that. And we'll finish off this course. All right. Thanks a lot.